Welcome to this 65th episode of Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name is Michael Dewan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach in private practice in London. As the title suggests, in this video, I'll propose a foundational value and telos, or future aspiration, for a new meta-narrative. My previous two videos were on the topic of meta-narratives, and I hadn't planned to make a third, but the more I thought about it, I knew there was something important that I had left unsaid. In the second video, I made a case for the need for a new meta-narrative, a new story about us that includes and integrates all of us. I'm not now going to say exactly what that narrative ought to be, but I am going to say what I think it ought to be rooted in and where it ought to point us for the future. What bedrock value or first principle could orient us in the best possible way? My proposal is simple. It's something that is overlooked and constantly forgotten as we argue over this and that. All other values and visions for the future, as valid and important as they may be, I will propose are secondary and must serve this primary value. Otherwise, they are useless at best and catastrophic at worst. The reason I want to offer this is because it seems the culture wars are reaching a divisive crescendo, and if we don't find a way forward together, we may just tear ourselves apart. Usually I critique the far left woke, but in this video what I have to say applies equally to all ideological systems, left, right, and other. Put simply, I propose that our foundational value should be life. We ought to value life. But let's not be immediately lured into assuming what may seem obvious. Let's make an argument for it. I'll frame my argument in terms of three basic things. One, what is true. Two, what values we apply to orient our behavior given what is true. And three, what ought we to do based on our values. Let's start with a famous is-ought problem that was first described by 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. To boil it down, he said you can't get an ought from an is. In other words, you can't rationally justify a moral injunction based purely on empirical facts. For instance, just because life appears to strive to survive and reproduce doesn't mean that that's what we ought to do. Just because some people starve doesn't mean that they should. There have been arguments against Hume's ideas, such as moral realism, moral naturalism, moral intuitionism. I'm not going to get into all of that. I'll just say that I think Hume is correct. You can't get an ought from an is. My argument may overlap with these other arguments, but I agree that an empirical, rational grasp of reality is not sufficient, but nor is it necessary for deciding what ought to be. What is necessary are emotions, but we'll get to that shortly. For now, consider this. The universe is nearly 14 billion years old. Life on Earth is between 3.5 and 4.5 billion years old. Life evolved through various forms and stages, adapting and reproducing through eons, and managed to produce human beings with a large triune brains. That brain can now question whether life has any value. Even though life has evolved and persisted for this long through its ability to perceive what is, value what sustains it, and act in a way that suggests it has an ought to guide its behavior, we can hypothetically choose to think and do otherwise. Ought we to do otherwise? If so, why? Based on what alternative value? Ought we to dispense with values and oughts altogether and behave in an utterly random manner? Would the results of that be equally desirable to any other results? How could we even assess desirability without values? Do all alternatives rouse the same emotions, or perhaps for a true non-believer, no emotions at all? My point again is that the value for life is not justified rationally. It arises instead as an emotional attachment to life, that life itself is instantiated in our brain-body system throughout our long evolution. To believe and act in any other way would require a profound dissociation from our very nature, the consequences of which would precipitate a spiral toward death. And there is no purely rational reason to not prefer death. But to leave philosophy aside for now and ground this in immediate experience, I'll ask you to do something. Don't just imagine doing this. Actually do it. Sit up straight. Put your hand over your heart. If you're comfortable to do so, grab your private parts with your other hand. Take a few breaths. Notice and feel you're alive. Let one more breath out. Before breathing in again, ask yourself if you ought to. Or instead, should you stop breathing, if you could, and die right here and now? Unless you are in some extremely grim situation, you will decide to breathe and continue living. You value your life. After deciding to breathe, anything else you do or think you ought to do, and whatever else you value, will presuppose that decision. You can philosophically and intellectually question whether life has value, but when it comes to your own life, you value it, whether you can rationally justify it or not. We justify this instead based first and primarily on our emotions or feelings. How we preserve life and what we do with it is another matter, and raises questions that reason does provide vitally important tools for answering. This exercise is meant to connect you immediately and personally with that fundamental experience of the value of life. That's a starting point. But it doesn't provide a narrative that tells us what we ought to do if we value all life. I propose that we value all life, not just our own. That's the foundation and telos for a functional new meta-narrative. On the surface, this may seem to be an obvious and sound moral conviction. But we need to ask, what is life, and how does it perpetuate itself? Without understanding this, we're likely to fashion many oughts that run counter to the reality of life. Just for a start, life persists by competing for resources and eating other life. What are we going to do about that? In addition to arguing for the primacy of the value of life, I'll argue that ideologies promoting secondary values ultimately run afoul of life when those values are dissociated from what life really is and what it really requires. Based on the values of freedom, equality, compassion, and generosity, for instance, there are many things we believe we ought to do, and perhaps should. Yet each of these secondary values, when taken as an absolute and dissociated from the realities and the demands of life as it is, becomes a sort of delusion that yields unfortunate consequences. Valuing all life ought not be naive about this. If you're liking this video, please give it a like. And if you aren't already subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe. Also, leave me a comment and let me know what you think. And finally, maybe you know someone else who would get something out of this video and you can share it with them. Thanks. All right, back to our topic. A primary strategy for accomplishing the dissociation that gives a green light to absolutistic moral convictions and ambitions for the perfectibility of man is the notion of the blank slate. This is the assertion that there is no human nature, so therefore we can be however we decide to be. Human beings are exempt from the laws of biology and nature that apply to all other forms of life. People can be educated or indoctrinated into any ideology or moral system we decide is best, and everything will work out fine. I don't think so. History provides ample evidence for how this can go wrong. It's my observation that most people don't fully recognize the profound difference it would make if the value for all life was truly foundational and understood on its own terms. Let me explain. Let's examine political ideologies in terms of their views of what is, what values they espouse, and what they propose ought to be done. For the sake of simplicity, I'll make some general claims about the values of the political right and left. In reality, it's much more complex, as there are and have been different ways of being on either side. But the point I want to make is about what happens when political or any other ideologies take certain limited views of the world, subscribe to a particular limited set of secondary values, and make demands about what ought to be done. I believe we wind up with zero-sum warring camps, and that if any succeed in winning, eventually we all lose. This is because to value and serve life as it is we need a broad range of secondary values, many of which seem to contradict each other. So, very generally speaking, left-leaning politics tends to see the human world in terms of identity groups locked in battles for power, where dominant groups exploit and oppress minority groups. All disparities of outcome in terms of wealth and well-being are a product of this reality. This gives rise to values such as equality, justice, protection from harm, and solidarity among the oppressed. These values give rise to proposals and demands for what ought to be done, such as progressive reforms, redistribution of wealth, expanded social welfare programs, labor rights, and anti-discrimination policies. The right, on the other hand, also very generally tends to view society as a collection of individuals who, through their choices and abilities, find themselves in different positions in life. Social hierarchies, traditions, and institutions such as family, religion, and nation are natural and necessary. Inequalities are considered inevitable and mostly the result of individual effort. Competition is a natural order of things. Following from this, they value individualism, tradition and order, and meritocracy. In terms of what ought to be, they believe government intervention ought to be limited. There ought to be a free market. Policies ought to encourage individual entrepreneurship, and taxes ought to be low. They also believe that social and cultural policies ought to maintain traditional values, law and order, and national identity. This is just the barest snapshot of left and right political views. My purpose in offering it is to make the point that neither one gets it all right or all wrong when it comes to what it is, what values are useful, and what ought to be done. Both make important contributions. But too often, neither one, and ideologies in general, start with a limited conception of life, adopt values limited to that conception, and push for oughts that do not address the full spectrum of what is and what life requires. They don't really put life as it is as their foundational value in Telos. They put their ideology first. This all begs a question. So what is life, and what does it require? I don't have the hubris it would take to pretend to give a complete answer to that question. That would be absurd. I can offer some general comments that begin to suggest that it is more complex and multifaceted than either the right or the left suppose. Life is a process that acts in a way that promotes its survival, thriving, and reproduction. Its survival is not guaranteed, but is accomplished through meeting its needs and adapting to its environment. All life needs food, water, safety, and an environment suited to its adaptive strategies in containing the food and resources it requires. All organisms have boundaries, a cell wall, or skin for keeping things in and out. But this must be porous, allowing nutrients in and waste to be expelled. As well, life defends itself from attacks, either by tooth, claw, club, sword, or gun. This goes for individuals and groups. For social animals, like humans, life also needs a stable, cohesive, collaborative social matrix. Life survives both through competition for resources and mates, but also by cooperation. Individuals compete against other individuals, and groups compete against other groups. Life requires both structure and predictability, as well as the freedom and capacity for creative change so that it can adapt to new environments and situations. This might mean physical evolutionary changes over time, or, particularly in the case of humans, behavioral and cultural change. Biologically, life is organized hierarchically in terms of cells, tissues, and organ systems, but hierarchy extends as well to social organization. Just as cells and organs function in service to the whole body, individuals and subgroups function in service to the greater social order. Hierarchy appears to be a universal organizational principle applying even to inorganic molecules. An individual group that doesn't serve the larger social order is like a toxin or cancer in the body. A social order that doesn't provide what is needed by its citizens and groups is like a body that doesn't meet the needs of its organs and cells. This is just a start at saying what life is. Hopefully it is clear that neither the left nor the right offer a story that includes all of this, nor do the values they rely on fully address life as it is. Consequently, what they insist must be done, their oughts, are insufficient. But if this much is true, what does that suggest about the secondary values that could serve life? Generally, there are values that apply to the individual and the collective dimensions of life. The left places great responsibility on the collective to protect and meet the needs of the individual and the minority groups, and little responsibility on individuals and subgroups for their own welfare or their responsibility to the larger collective. The right places great responsibility on the individual and subgroups for their own well-being, and often neglects the responsibility of the greater collective for the well-being of all individuals and subgroups. Life requires both. The right is big on boundaries and borders and defenses, and is skeptical of porous borders, sometimes shutting out what is needed. The left is big on porous boundaries and borders, or no boundaries at all, in the name of inclusion and compassion, and fails to protect what needs protection. Life requires both. When it comes to the social matrix, the left emphasizes the value of cooperation, and the right emphasizes the value of competition. As already mentioned, life requires both. The right places value in hierarchy, structure, and tradition, and resists change, even when it's necessary. The left values creativity, novelty, and change, and will deconstruct hierarchy and structure in the name of freedom and justice, even when hierarchies and structures serve vital functions. For the left, hierarchy equals oppression. Life requires both. This is just a few examples of what I'm getting at. Perhaps you can think of more. But if we place life as our foundational value and recognize what life really is and what it requires, and we embrace a broad range of sometimes contradictory values that we aspire to fulfill, what would be the agenda for what we ought to do? That's the question. I'm not going to provide an answer. I'm not sure what we should do. I'm sure, however, that if we don't start here, we're unlikely to head in a good, life-affirming direction. And that direction, or telos, ought to be the preservation and thriving of life through endless creative and adaptive modifications and transformations, while also not losing sight of what changes life cannot endure. Another thing about life, it's vulnerable. We are vulnerable to all kinds of things. I want to talk about a particular vulnerability. We can be manipulated by being told what is, encouraged to amplify our emotional reaction, and given a set of instructions for what we therefore ought to do. Just because we feel something does not mean we fully know what is true or what ought to be done. In the gap of our uncertainty, we can be persuaded. This brings me to political parties and their ideologies. These groups present facts and stories about what is, how we are to feel about it, and what we ought to do, including who we should vote for. Trump's press secretary, Kellyanne Conway, once famously referred to alternate facts. This was mocked as a disregard for facts, as if there is only one set of facts which all point to the same conclusion. Saying there are alternate facts was derided as an indirect admission of lying, which also happens, by the way. But there are an infinite number of facts from which one can select to support one's conclusions about what is. In that way, one can lie while also telling the truth. This is at the heart of politics. The question is, are political actors, whether holding office or as citizens, benevolent or malevolent? What are their motivations? Do they truly hold to the good of all, or do they have only self-interest, elite interest, or some other limited group interest? I believe that some political actors are malevolent and deliberately limited in their interests. Others are benevolent, but because they have a limited vision of what is, they propose action plans with unintended negative consequences for many. It seems that those few with a more comprehensive view of what is, and therefore a more complex set of proposals about what ought to be done, have great difficulty being elected or otherwise having significant influence. Why? I'm going to guess that it's because their greater vision of what is evokes complex emotional responses, often contradictory and therefore not simple enough for strong motivation. And their correspondingly complex action plans involve too many trade-offs and are too difficult for most people to understand. When politicians present their limited views of what is and rouse public sentiments about it, this creates self-reinforcing groups or political tribes. Each has its own perception of reality and corresponding emotional reactions. Then these groups become antagonistic to one another. Emotions are amplified further by having an enemy that holds different views and values. Then the ought becomes defeat the enemy. This is politics. This is human nature. Tragically, in such zero-sum competitions for power, entire realms of what is, or alternate facts, are swept out of consideration and not incorporated into the ought of an action plan. The losers, the disaffected, lick their wounds, wait for the next election, protest, riot in the streets. The emotions that had prompted their political campaign turn to rage, bitterness, resentment, despair, and depression, and can remain chronic. Yet even these defeated souls want nothing more than to be victorious over their enemies. They want to persist in ignoring other truths about the world and dismiss the values of their enemies as evil. Whoever is not on their side is either evil, stupid, or both. They are satisfied to imagine the day that their enemies will experience the same painful defeat that they suffered, but hopefully, once and for all. I think it must be said again that some political actors are malevolent and should be defeated. They distort the truth of what is for selfish motivations to the peril of us all. We ought to resist them. The great challenge is to accurately identify such actors and not falsely attribute malevolence to those espousing other important values based on emotions evoked by other true things. In democratic systems that govern many millions of people, what are the chances that substantial populations have the necessary intelligence, discernment, and wisdom to tell the difference? I'm the one saying all of this, and I struggle with it myself. But I believe our survival depends on it, nevertheless. I have one more thorny issue to address before I conclude. That's the question of what we mean by value when it comes to life. There are two basic ways to think about value, and both are valid and necessary. They are intrinsic and extrinsic or instrumental value. When it comes to people, intrinsic value means that each person has value simply by virtue of being alive. This value suggests that everyone ought to be treated with basic respect and dignity, given equal rights and protections, treated the same under the law, and have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for instance. Intrinsic value is unconditional. Extrinsic or instrumental value is measured by how much a person contributes to or benefits others. Do they help? Are they generous with resources? Can they be relied upon? Can they solve problems that trouble others? Do they have special knowledge or skills that are useful? The well-being of the collective depends on its members making useful contributions and needs to be able to assess this value and encourage members to take roles that fit with their instrumental value. Instrumental value is conditional upon what and how much people can or are willing to contribute. Generally, the left emphasizes intrinsic unconditional value. It believes people deserve resources by the simple virtue of being alive. For instance, they advocate for UBI or universal basic income, or by virtue of being a member of a disadvantaged group, people should be given opportunities without any measure of their likely instrumental value. The right is more about extrinsic conditional value. It believes that people should offer an instrumental benefit to others as a condition for being rewarded with resources. Opportunities should be offered, but only rewarded to those who have the merit and demonstrate the extrinsic value. They tend to oppose UBI and affirmative action. My assertion is that to value all life, again with a full understanding of what life is, requires both kinds of value. One without the other causes problems. We need to value people intrinsically and strive to create conditions that foster an equal opportunity for everyone to develop their talents and abilities, or their extrinsic instrumental value, and apply the same measures for merit to everyone. This is not just because it's the morally right thing to do, although it is. It's because it's what serves the thriving of life, both individually and collectively. When deciding that all life is the foundational value in Telos, there are many other challenging questions that arise about what that really means and how it can be acted upon. I've thought and written about this quite a bit, but have not included those thoughts in this video. It's just too big. But hopefully, I've gotten across the kernel of the idea well enough for you to mull it over. Thanks for joining me and sticking with me to the end. Until next time, and I hope you will return, take care of yourself and each other, and by doing so, may life continue and thrive. Bye for now.